HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents Tasting the Past, the Science of Flavor and the Search for the Origins of Wine, by Kevin Begos, read by P.J. Ochlan. Part 1. We're still caught in that trap of saying, well, there are only 10 good grape varieties in the whole world, and that's it. There are wonderful wines to be made everywhere from a huge number of varieties. Andy Walker, Louis P. Martini Endowed Chair in Viticulture, University of California, Davis. 1. A Mysterious Wine. The wine of life keeps oozing drop by drop. The leaves of life keep falling one by one. Omar Khayyam, The Rubaiyat, circa 1100. Alone in Amman, Jordan, I looked at the minibar skeptically, yet wistfully. Finding good wine in a hotel room is a tantalizing concept, but I had a rule. Never buy the stuff. This place had rustic tiles and carved wooden doors in the lobby that gave way to generic rooms. Clean and fairly comfortable, but like a Holiday Inn, without character. I was fidgety. Watching Arabic TV without understanding a word was only briefly entertaining. The evening call to prayers from a nearby mosque reminded me of the limited alcohol options, and I knew hardly anyone in the city. I went over to the TV cabinet, opened the door again, and sadly contemplated the row of bottles next to the little refrigerator. One red wine had an unusual label with old-fashioned type and images. It read, "Produced and bottled by Cremazan Cellars, Holy Land, Bethlehem." That seemed odd. It was the spring of 2008, and there were still vineyards in Bethlehem? My hazy Catholic childhood taught me that people drank wine there in biblical times, but I'd never seen Cremazan on a store shelf or restaurant list or in a review. The label said they started making wine in 1885, which I found interesting, but also curious. Had no critics checked it out? The winery is just a few miles from Jerusalem. The bottle was the only thought-provoking thing in the room, and I was tired, physically and emotionally, from a Middle East reporting assignment. With low expectations, I broke my rule, pulled the cork, and took a sip. Wow! I perked up immediately. The dry red wine had a spicy flavor, sort of Syrah-ish, but not quite. It was drinkable, balanced, and pleasingly different, with even a hint of earthy terroir. I went to bed happier, imagining it might be fun to visit Cremazan. But deadlines beckoned for the rest of the trip. I returned to the United States planning to buy another bottle at home to share with friends. No luck. Visits to wine stores drew blank stares. Cremazan didn't have an American importer, so I couldn't even buy the wine online. When I told the story, some suggested that I air freight a few bottles. They didn't get the torturous nature of international wine shipping laws. Bethlehem is technically in the Palestinian territories, and that didn't help either, especially after the Second Intifada, or uprising. I tried emailing the winery, but got no response. There was something else, too. I was getting bored with the Chardonnays, Merlots, Cabernet Sauvignons, and Rieslings in every wine store and on every restaurant list. I'm not against those grapes. Of course, they make some wonderful wines. But why the lack of diversity? Wasn't there more? Little details about Cremazan kept me intrigued. Once, when I looked for news of my wine Madeleine, I found Cremazan's rudimentary website. The winemaker was an Italian monk, and the monastery was built near the ruins of a 7th century Byzantine church. They made some Merlot, but also used local grapes I'd never heard of. Red Baladi, White Jandali, and Hamdani. Had they really grown in this region for thousands of years? Did Cremazan use native grapes to make wine that the Egyptians, biblical prophets, and Romans might have drunk? The buying difficulty was perplexing. Why wouldn't a nice, modestly priced wine from a vineyard in the heart of the Holy Land have at least a small built-in market? Perhaps the monks were indifferent to worldly marketing. Who ever heard of monks in the Middle East making wine in the 21st century anyway? The website showed various labels with a jumble of multicultural wine references. Côte de Cremazan, Old Hock, David's Tower, Cana of Galilee, and Blanc de Blanc, made from selected Dabuki local white grapes grown in the mountains of Bethlehem. I listed influences and came up with Italian, French, Christian, Jewish, Arabic, British, German, Spanish. In a region so fractured by ethnic and religious wars, this melting pot was sort of endearing. The memory of my hotel room wine lingered like the refrain of an old pop song. In 2011, I moved on to a busy job as a correspondent for the Associated Press, and soon afterwards I looked for Cremazan or their mysterious grapes in the third edition of the authoritative Oxford Companion to Wine, which was the current one at the time. Nothing. The entry on Israel said vineyards there were destroyed after the spread of Islam in AD 636, and that the Crusaders temporarily restored wine production between AD 1100 and 1300, but with the exile of the Jews, vine growing ceased. Supposedly, no real wine industry existed until Baron Edmond de Rothschild started a winery in the 1880s. Even worse, it said Israel currently had no indigenous varieties of grapes. But another entry on a nearby page of the Oxford Companion, under Islam, said that in the Middle Ages, Muslim conquest by no means outlawed wine production, and that Arabs even tried finer wines made in the Christian monasteries of Iraq. Abu Nuwas, who lived in Baghdad around AD 800, was famous for his scandalous poems about drinking, with lines such as, "Pour me a glass of wine, and confirm that it's wine. Do not do it in secret, when it can be done in the open." I was confused. Wine's supposed disappearance from the Holy Land seemed to be one of those lazy cultural stereotypes that appears to make perfect sense, until you realize it doesn't. That region had significant Christian and Jewish communities from the 7th to 20th centuries, under many different rulers. Islam's wine prohibition didn't apply to them. How could winemaking and vineyards have vanished? But I didn't really have the time to explore Middle Eastern wine history. Tracking down bottles from Cremazan fell to the bottom of my to-do lists. I'd stumbled on an unusual wine. Nothing more. From time to time, though, whenever I read a little pocket-sized book of Persian poetry I was fond of, I'd be reminded of possible holes in the Oxford Companion narrative. In the 1300s, Hafiz wrote, "Now that I have raised the glass of pure wine to my lips, the nightingale starts to sing." And this by Rumi in the 1200s. That jug full of wine has brought me to such a state that I have broken so many jars today. Sometimes the Muslim wine poets spoke metaphorically about alcohol, but to me, the vivid lines also suggest real-life experience. Medieval Jewish wine poets who had lived in what is now Israel wrote about wine too. "When your heart is cradled in sorrow, and trouble today and tomorrow, day after day, drink the liquid of the grape, my friend." Israel ben Moses Najara, circa 1555 to 1625. Persians, Arabs, and Jews, all reciting wine poems through the centuries when vineyards supposedly disappeared because of Islam. But poems aren't historical proof. And who was I to question the Oxford Companion to Wine anyway? I could even see why the modern wine trade ignored such history, and Cremazan. As I pored over wine poems, Chinese billionaires bought up Bordeaux vineyards, and California's Napa Valley boom continued, helped by surging tech fortunes and eager consumers. Single bottles from Burgundy's Domaine de la Romanée Conti, one of the world's most famous wineries, auctioned for more than $10,000. Cremazan was a viticultural David up against Goliaths. Why care about the history of obscure Middle Eastern grapes when there is so much money sloshing around the wine world? Memories of the hotel room bottle faded. I gave up looking for Cremazan wine. Until I heard about José Vuillamot's work. He co-authored the landmark 2012 book Wine Grapes with Jancis Robinson and Julia Harding, and it raised my hopes. The authors described 1,368 varieties of grapes used to make wine all over the world, explored the history of each one, and included diagrams of wine grape family trees based on DNA research. The book won a James Beard Award, plus many other international honors. It's an encyclopedia of famous varieties, plus rare ones on the verge of extinction. The book enthralled me, and exposed the extent of my wine ignorance. I eagerly typed Cremazan into the Wine Grapes ebook search box, along with the names of their unusual grapes. Nothing. I contacted Vuillamot, hoping for some shred of encouragement. I must confess something almost embarrassing. We missed them. The grapes they are growing are not in our book, because at that time we had never heard of them. Neither me nor Jancis Robinson. So it shows you how obscure they were, at least a few years ago, he told me. Robinson is one of the most famous, knowledgeable, and respected critics in the world. I was infatuated with a winery she'd never heard of. Maybe I'd found an arcane wine history error about who drank what when in the Oxford Companion. So what? It was all feeling like some wild grape chase, trying to link Cremazan to a perhaps mystical ancient wine. But wine grapes led to a different realization. I wanted to learn about wine, not be preached at. I was tired of excessively florid reviews with laundry lists of all the flavors and aromas in a glass, and skeptical of critics who claimed the ability to distinguish between 92, 95, or 100-point bottles. Now I saw the obvious. Wine grape DNA can be analyzed the way a home cheek swab kit delivers data about your family tree. Evolution leaves a trail, whether it's Neanderthals splitting from Homo sapiens or the birth of a new grape variety. My hotel room wine morphed from an obsession into training wheels. I understood that obscure grapes weren't just quirkily interesting, each had a special flavor profile. Losing one could mean losing certain tastes forever. Vuillamot's genetic detective work inspired all sorts of questions. Where did wine grapes originate? I didn't even know how to define ancient grape varieties. Did it mean 500 years old or 5,000? And why do grapes express so many flavors and aromas, when rice and grains, also used to make alcohol, don't? I had no idea. Wine grapes also suggested the beginnings of a movement. Vineyards all over the world determined to preserve native grapes. I made lists of the curious wines from Armenia, Greece, France, and many other countries, wanting to try them all. Assyrtiko, Chinori, Kessi, Maratheftico, Nero d'Avola, Saperavi, Tana, Violento, Xinisteri. The vineyard equivalents of slow food, multicolored heirloom vegetables, or craft whiskey. For the first time, I understood that endless vineyards of Cabernet, Chardonnay, and Merlot had pushed aside hundreds of local varieties over the last century. Other connections emerged. The modern wine industry looked more and more like a dressed-up version of industrial agriculture, designed to produce maximum yields at the lowest cost. That reminded me of Michael Pollan's observation about apples in The Botany of Desire. The industry got together and decided it would be wise to simplify that market by planting and promoting only a small handful of brand-name varieties. Thomas Jefferson loved Esopus Spitzenberg apples, and early Americans enjoyed dozens more: Newtown Pippins, Roxbury Russets, and Ashmead's Kernels. But in the 20th century, Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, Granny Smith, and Macintosh took over in much the same way a few French grapes took over the world's vineyards. It's not just apples and wine. Take bananas. One called Cavendish occupies 90% of the world market, even though there are about 1,000 banana varieties in the world. Flowers? I knew from Amy Stewart's Flower Confidential that most popular varieties have almost no scent, because the industry cares more about size, color, and the ability to travel. Corporate winemaking even helped limit some wines made from the famous grapes. The Atlantic published the article The Dark Side of Wine by wildly influential wine critic Robert M. Parker, Jr. in 2000. In it, he opined, "It seems to be the tragedy of modern winemaking that it is now increasingly difficult to tell an Italian Chardonnay from one made in France or California or Australia. When the corporate winemakers of the world begin to make wines all in the same way, designing them to offend the least number of people, wine will no doubt lose its fascinating appeal and individualism to become no better than most brands of whiskey, gin, scotch, or vodka." Statistics show there is cause to worry. A study in the Journal of Wine Economics found that between 1990 and 2010, Cabernet Sauvignon and Merlot more than doubled their share in the world's vineyards. By 2010, French grape varieties comprised 67% of vineyard acreage in New World countries, up from 53% just 10 years before. Wine is supposedly all about variety, but it's easier and cheaper to limit the range of tastes and flavors we experience. At their best, the leading French grapes produce luscious, beautifully complex wine. But that's alongside a tidal wave of industrial, filtered, so-so product. In 2014, the Bordeaux region alone produced about 700 million bottles. All this new information was overwhelming, and it raised questions for me. Wine grapes illuminated the loss of wine grape diversity and the efforts to preserve rare varieties, but it was a work in progress. The big fold-out genealogy charts focused on Europe. There were gaps in the Caucasus Mountains and the Middle East, regions that were making wine thousands of years before the French or Italians. That seemed akin to using Columbus as the starting point for North American history. Yet wine grapes did a superb job of showing how many European grapes share a few common ancestors. A once scorned grape called Gouais Blanc is related to more than 80 different varieties, including Riesling, one of the world's most popular grapes. The point? Even if you don't care about rare grapes, we wouldn't be drinking many wines without them. So, I was back to wondering, were the varieties Cremezan used part of an earlier, forgotten network of founder grapes? The DNA of some undiscovered vine should have the answer, in theory. Perhaps I could seek out rare native grapes with unusual tastes and try to understand the origins of wine at the same time. A scientific puzzle with wine tasting? Count me in. One day I visited the Wine Grapes website and saw a note. The authors explained that they had missed some grape varieties and asked for suggestions, promising to include the first 10 winners in future editions of the book. There they were, Cremazan's grapes. Gal Zohar, the sommelier for the world-famous London restaurant Ottolenghi, won for submitting the Baladi, Jandali, Dabuki, and Hamdani grapes. After 5 years of futile scrounging for information, I no longer felt so alone. Someone else liked the Cremazan wine too. 2. Archaeobiology and Ancient Wine. Beside the sea she lives, the woman of the vine, the maker of wine. Siduri sits in the garden at the edge of the sea. The Epic of Gilgamesh. Cremazan and wine grapes led me to another scientist. University of Pennsylvania archaeologist Patrick McGovern is often called the Indiana Jones of ancient wine and beer. He received his undergraduate chemistry degree from Cornell and his neurochemistry PhD from the University of Rochester's Brain Research Center. He studied biblical archaeology in Jerusalem, lectured on Egypt in the time of the pharaohs at Rutgers, and has done fieldwork in Jordan, Syria, Iran, Armenia, China, and many other countries. McGovern was one of José Vuillamot's early mentors. In 2004, they traveled to the Middle East together to research wine grape origins. In the 1980s, McGovern helped pioneer an emerging field: biomolecular archaeology. Even unbelievably faint residues, 1 part per million or billion on ancient pottery, still contain chemical fingerprints of the liquids and foods they once held. Inspired by advances in radiocarbon dating and medical analysis, archaeologists and botanists use mass spectrometry and even nuclear reactors to decipher what people ate and drank thousands of years ago. A mass spectrometer weighs molecules, sorts them according to weight, then counts the number of each weight. According to Harold Wiley, a pioneer who helped expand use of the tool in the 1940s. The molecular weight can reveal the exact compound that's present. I sent McGovern an email about the Cremazan grapes. Sadly, he didn't have anything to offer, leaving me with yet another of the world's leading wine experts who didn't seem excited about what I'd come to think of as my grapes. But McGovern's research was thought-provoking. It sometimes reads like a fictional script for CSI Ancient Alcohol, or proof of physicist Richard Feynman's famous comment about wine's complexity. Feynman worked on the Manhattan Project in World War II and won a Nobel Prize for quantum electrodynamics research, how matter and light interact. During a lecture in the 1960s, he made these observations. A poet once said, "The whole universe is in a glass of wine." I don't think we'll ever know in what sense he meant that, for the poets don't write to be understood. But it is true that if you look at a glass of wine closely enough, you will see the entire universe. There are the things of physics, the twisting liquid, the reflections in the glass, and our imagination adds the atoms. It evaporates depending on the wind and weather. The glass is a distillation of the Earth's rocks, and in its composition, as we've seen, the secret of the universe's age and the evolution of the stars. What strange array of chemicals are in wine? How did they come to be? There are the ferments, the enzymes, the substrates, and products. And there in wine is found the great generalization. All life is fermentation. If our small minds, for some convenience, divide this glass of wine, this universe into parts: the physics, biology, geology, astronomy, psychology, and all. Remember that nature doesn't know it. So we should put it all back together and not forget at last what it's for. Let it give us one final pleasure more. Drink it up and forget about it all. Processes such as liquid chromatography, Greek word root chroma, color, plus graphia, drawing or writing, revolutionized the study of ancient wine. It can separate a sample of just a few parts per trillion into distinct chemicals. Picture deconstructing a recipe down to the molecular level, or cleaning a tiny fleck of dried something or other from your refrigerator and reverse engineering it to uncover the original food. It works because the molecules of different elements vary in weight. Liquid chromatography puts tiny samples in liquid form, where the various elements move at different speeds through a test container of solid material, thus precisely isolating the compounds for further study. Such tests helped identify the types of wine in King Tut's tomb. Spanish researchers identified 3 types made from about 1500 to 1075 BC: a red, a white, and a more elaborate red wine called Chardonnay. One of McGovern's projects looked at residue on 5,000-year-old Egyptian amphoras, the clay containers that carried wine, oil, fruit, and grain all over the Mediterranean, and compared them to an amphora from about AD 500. The older samples came from the tomb of one of Egypt's first rulers, Scorpion I, which contained about 700 amphoras in 3 chambers. The first challenge was proving what the contents were. It could have been wine or not. However, the scientists recovered a tiny but identifiable fragment of Saccharomyces cerevisiae DNA, yeast, and tartaric acid, which is a grape biomarker. Some containers also had remains of grape seeds and of single figs sliced in half, perhaps to add sweetness or improve fermentation. The Scorpion I wine showed possible traces of coriander, wormwood, blue tansy, and pine resin, which was used as a combination flavoring antioxidant. The chemical residue could also have come from mint, sage, or thyme. The remains made sense when McGovern compared them to Egyptian papyrus writings about medicine, since herbs and spices served as flavorings and drugs for the ancient world. One papyrus is over 100 pages long, and many of the 1,000-plus prescriptions were mixed with wine and beer, likely an effective way to get medicine to patients, and early evidence of homeopathy. In recent years, various researchers in the Middle East and throughout the Mediterranean have found evidence for a wide range of ancient wine flavorings: frankincense, myrrh, cumin, dill, fennel, aloe, and balm. At another Egyptian site dating to about AD 400, amphoras were scattered around Nubian-era taverns like kegs at a biker bar, suggesting wine had become a drink for commoners. Some of the people were buried nearby with amphoras too. The typical size held 30 or 40 gallons. Amphoras are found all over the Mediterranean, and one huge Egyptian dumping ground may contain remains of more than 1 million. Not too long ago, scientists counted, measured, and photographed them. To find out where they were manufactured, McGovern put some of the shards inside a nuclear reactor. Using instrumental neutron activation analysis, INAA, tiny ground-up samples of 4,000-year-old pottery were bombarded with neutron beams, so their basic chemical elements turned radioactive. The precise soil composition found on each sample was measured using gamma-ray emissions, providing a soil fingerprint. McGovern's team compared the results to databases of clay deposits. The result: Amphoras weren't made all over the place. Just as Pittsburgh was known for steel and Detroit for cars, most of the ancient...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?